The Citizenship Project is brought to you in part by a grant from the Tennessee Civil War National Heritage Area and the First Tennessee Foundation.
There is nothing, and never has been, anything automatic about the quest for rights. When one can lay claim to the blood debt, we have died on the battlefield, that's where you are most likely to make political headway.
Women were strengthened by the role that they played in this horrible war.
Before I could be a citizen, I could be a patriot. The military service becomes an exercise in manhood. If I can stand there toe-to-toe with an enemy of my nation and I can fight, then I might gain the respect that I so much deserve.
The citizens of Memphis were accustomed to seeing Union troops. The city had been under federal occupation since the summer of 1862, but they had never seen any soldiers like the 1st Tennessee Infantry.
As it marched with steady step to the music of its own band through the main street of that once proud but now humbled city, the inhabitants saw, as they peered from their windows or stores, what they had never before seen and had never expected to see: their own former slaves, powerfully and lawfully armed for their overthrow, and led and commanded by those whom they considered their invaders. The sight must have burned into their very souls. Yesterday a slave, today a free man. Yesterday a civilian, today a soldier. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cowden, Commander, 1st Tennessee Volunteer Infantry.
One of the most amazing stories of the Civil War period that we forget is how these freedmen joined the United States Army and fought for the United States during the Civil War, and they were not citizens yet of the country. So I always think of these men lining up to go into battle behind a flag that they could carry and they could touch, but it really didn't mean anything directly to them yet. But clearly from their letters and diaries and different accounts, it meant the world to them to fight for that flag, to go out there and say, we can earn our citizenship, we can earn the respect of others by fighting for the United States.
There are really two dominant ways in democracies that people think and talk about citizenship. One is that we are all entitled to certain basic rights as citizens of the United States. But there is another tradition, far older, which comes out of very similar roots, which says that in fact, those who deserve first-class citizenship are those who make the greatest contributions to the public good. And the chief way of demonstrating one's commitment to the common good, of course, the most salient way, is by sacrificing on the battlefield. And so when one can lay claim to the blood debt, we have died on the battlefield, that's where you are most likely to make political headway.
Sometime in the fire.
For enslaved African Americans, freedom was the first objective. And in Tennessee, opportunity arrived in February 1862.
As soon as the Civil War started, slaves began escaping from the plantations when they heard the Union Army was nearby. And so they are freeing themselves. People say they were freed by the Union Army. The Union Army really didn't want to have anything to do with this social problem, as they called it. But the slaves were taking their own initiatives, and they were leaving and they were coming into contact with the Union Army wherever they could, by the thousands, and especially in two places where most of the Civil War's battles took place. Number one, Virginia, and number two, Tennessee.
Union forces began conscripting the freedmen as laborers. It would take President Lincoln's Militia Act of 1862 to place them on the battlefield.
When first the rebel cannon shattered the walls of Sumter, I predicted that the war would not be fought out entirely by white men. A war undertaken for the perpetual enslavement of colored men calls logically and loudly for colored men to help suppress it. This is our golden opportunity. Let us win for ourselves the gratitude of our country and the best blessings of our posterity through all time. Frederick Douglass.
United States colored troops would prove themselves time and time again in battles throughout the South, but never more bravely than in Tennessee, where a young Union officer and future author would lose any doubt about their will to fight.
At the Battle of Nashville, it was borne in upon me that I had made a fool of myself. In an assault upon the Confederate line by a brigade of Beatty's division and a colored brigade of raw troops, better fighting was never done. They did not hesitate a moment. Their long line swept into that fatal obstruction in perfect order, and remained there as long as those of the white veterans on their right. It was as pretty an example of courage and discipline as one could wish to see. Ambrose Bierce.
It was the first time in the memorable history of the Army of the Cumberland that the blood of black and white men flowed freely together for one common cause for our country's freedom and independence. Now we may, as a people, claim political equality with our white fellow soldier and citizen, and every man that makes his home in our country may exclaim to the world, "I am an American citizen." Sergeant Major Daniel Atwood, 100th United States Colored Troops.
That was a decisive battle, the Battle of Nashville. 4 months later, Lee surrenders, because that army, under General John Bell Hood, the Confederate Army of Tennessee, was destroyed. And once that army was destroyed, all of the Western theater was completely in the hands of the Union Army. Now they could shift resources over to Grant, who has Robert E. Lee penned in. So the war was already over in December 1864, and that was because of the Battle of Nashville, bringing it to a close.
Just a few weeks later, a few miles from the battlefield, a Unionist convention was held at the Capitol to form a new state government. While there were no African Americans in attendance, dozens had signed a petition laying claim to the rights of citizenship as reward for their service, their blood debt.
We, the undersigned petitioners, American citizens of African descent, natives and residents of Tennessee, and devoted friends of the great national cause, know the burdens of citizenship and are ready to bear them. Nearly 200,000 of our brethren are today performing military duty in the ranks of the Union Army. Thousands of them have already died in battle. What higher order of citizen is there than the soldier? If we are called on to do military duty against the rebel armies in the field, why should we be denied the privilege of voting against rebel citizens at the ballot box? The government has asked the colored man to fight for its preservation, and gladly has he done it. It can afford to trust him with a vote as safely as it trusted him with a bayonet.
Tennessee's Reconstruction experience differed greatly from other Southern states. It was spared occupation by federal troops under the Military Reconstruction Acts, with radical Unionist Governor William G. Parson Brownlow in control. It was the first state to rejoin the Union by ratifying the 14th Amendment, granting citizenship to African Americans.
Tennessee was a place of optimism under the Brownlow administration. Tennessee had been a place of optimism for African Americans under Andrew Johnson. There's about a 10, 12-year period there when if you can get to Tennessee from the Deep South, then you have the chance. Schools opening here, black men in the military. The Fort Negley story is well known throughout the African American community about black men building forts. Also, the ability to be mustered into the military in Tennessee by the Union forces is a great attraction.
Not everyone shared that optimism. New rights for freedmen, including suffrage, infuriated former Confederates who had been disenfranchised. Banned from the government, they made their voices heard with vigilante violence through the birth of the Ku Klux Klan and similar groups. Unionists would remain in control for a few years, but shortly after Governor Brownlow left for Washington as a senator, state government fell back into the hands of Confederate sympathizers.
After the war, it was pretty tough for those African American men who had served in the Union Navy or the Union Army, especially in Tennessee, because the Confederates returned to power very quickly, 1870. They revised the Constitution of Tennessee in 1870. And of course, those men were punished, and all African Americans, because if you read the Constitution of 1870, the delegates proclaimed this is a white man's government, outright.
The promise of Reconstruction would soon be overshadowed by the oppression of the Jim Crow era. Poll taxes, literacy tests, segregation laws, and the threat of lynching would deny freedmen full payment for their blood debt. Facing an unpromising future, thousands of Black Tennesseans would leave the state in search of a better life. A former slave from Williamson County would get an early start by enlisting in the Army, leading to a career on the western frontier.
George Jordan, who was born about 1848, when he entered the military, he could neither read nor write. He taught himself to read and write. He would travel out west and become what a part of us known as the Buffalo Soldiers. On one occasion, after being promoted to sergeant, a very difficult task for a man of color. He makes just about the highest rank you can hope to achieve. They are Indian fighters. They fight the Sioux and the Apache, and George Jordan, for saving one community, is awarded the Medal of Honor.
Jordan would spend nearly 30 years in the cavalry, retiring in 1896. He would die 8 years later as a result of being denied medical attention at the post hospital in Fort Robinson, Nebraska. Service was not denied at the Fort Robinson Cemetery, where the Medal of Honor recipient was buried with full military honors. Jordan attained America's most prestigious award as a soldier, but as a citizen, he was deemed unworthy of the most basic human right.
If a lower race mixes with a higher in sufficient numbers, the lower race will prevail. The lower race will absorb the higher. There is a limit to the capacity of any race for assimilating and elevating an inferior race. And when you begin to pour in unlimited numbers, people of alien or lower races of less social efficiency and less moral force, you are running the most frightful risk that a people can run. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, Massachusetts.
We often forget not only how deeply racist was the United States in the first half of the 20th century, but also how deeply racialist, by which I mean that Americans simply thought in deeply racial categories. If you were from Southern and Eastern Europe, at that time mostly Jews, Greeks, Italians, if you were Irish, you were essentially considered as being somewhere farther down on the racialist scale. In fact, it was often thought that Irish in particular were essentially, to use the language of the time, no different from Negroes, right? And were simply another kind of Negro as they understood it at the time. In the early 20th century, the United States was welcoming huge numbers of foreign-born to America's shores. And there was a lot of concern, as there is today, about what would this do to American culture? Would these people become American, whatever that meant, or would they change what it meant to be American? And of course, every generation that prides itself on being American wants things to stay exactly as they are.
Now, bringing these people in created some social problems because of the difficulties in their ability to assimilate. It was really very difficult for them in the beginning, and once again you see a little movement of xenophobia starting in the 1890s that will really become very pervasive during the time of the Great War. Over in Shelby County, in an area called Germantown, for a brief period of time, they renamed that area Nashoba during World War I.
Regarded with distrust by some Americans, immigrants were welcomed with open arms by the military.
The most obvious way in which service and citizenship have been related has been in the realm of immigrants. Whenever the U.S. military has needed soldiers, a sure way to do so is to invite those who are not native born into the military and promise them citizenship in exchange. This is a time-honored way of earning formal citizenship. Theodore Roosevelt's hope was that if you bring large numbers of people into the military, they will emerge with a stronger sense of national cohesion. This would Americanize the unwashed hordes that would come to America's shores and to make them into true blue Americans, like many other progressives. That was the hope. They also firmly believed in the American melting pot, but they did not have great faith that that melting pot could simply work very well on its own. They thought that melting pot needed strong institutions that would ensure that good American values were taught to these people who they associated with being farther down on the racial scale.
As the United States entered the war, hundreds of thousands of immigrants would answer the call. Nearly 20% of Army recruits were foreign-born. Some units gained fame as a result of the number of immigrants in their ranks. Consisting of Italian, Chinese, Russian, Irish, and Jewish soldiers from New York, the 77th Infantry was nicknamed the Melting Pot Division. Ultimately, 13 immigrant troops would receive the Medal of Honor. And due to expedited naturalization for military service, more than 300,000 would become citizens, acknowledging their battlefield sacrifice. Hoping to gain their own reward at the ballot box, suffragists were eager to prove themselves loyal, hard-working patriots by joining the war effort.
Women had long been advocating for the vote, and during World War I, saw an opportunity to gain the vote. The idea being that if we are going to serve as nurses in the military, if we're going to serve in war industries, then we are entitled to the vote.
When Woodrow Wilson became president, the suffragists had some hope that he might support suffrage and he might be the president to see that an amendment to the Constitution was added. He was a man who had 3 daughters, and he surely was interested in women being treated equally, and yet Woodrow Wilson was very wary of supporting suffrage. And this really enraged some of the suffragists that when the war broke out, he still would not support this amendment to the Constitution for women to have the right to vote. Women mobilized in a manner that they had never mobilized before when the United States entered the war in 1917.
Women's efforts on the home front were essential, but overwhelming numbers of casualties over there created a demand for medical expertise in France.
When America entered the First World War, the military wasn't quite ready, and so a call went out from the Surgeon General for nurses.
And the Red Cross answered. Some 24,000 were recruited to serve in the armed forces, with over 10,000 stationed on the Western Front. Despite the need for help, segregation would prevent many from serving.
There were also thousands of trained, registered African American nurses who were not called up. The Surgeon General's office claimed that there were not the quarters or the mess for the African American nurses, so they just put them on standby all through the war, basically. But it was only when the flu epidemic hit that the Surgeon General's office finally called up all these nurses that were waiting. None of them ever went overseas, but at least they were brought into the Army Nurse Corps and served an important role in camps here in the United States.
While the nurses were fighting influenza, which would prove deadlier than the war itself, suffragists were busy fighting each other.
The suffragists really more or less had a parting of the ways related to tactics. The older, more established suffragists felt that the suffragists should abandon their cause for the duration of the war and should show the President and Congress how much women could do to support a war, and then when the war ended, the President and Congress would see that the amendment got sent to the states for ratification. Alice Paul, however, and a group of younger women preferred more militant tactics. They felt that the war provided a great opportunity to pressure President Wilson into supporting the war. They took the tactics of, we have got to get attention for our effort with parades. They had signs comparing the president to the Kaiser, and many of these women were arrested. They went on a hunger strike in a Washington, D.C. jail. They felt that the time had come to embarrass the president enough for him to support their cause.
They would not be disappointed. Once the war was over, the push for a 19th Amendment granting women the right to vote picked up steam.
President Wilson did, in fact, endorse the amendment, and in 1919, in June, both houses of Congress passed it so that it was sent to the states for ratification. And the Tennessee women had laid the groundwork for this by all of this work that they had been doing throughout the United States' involvement with World War I.
African Americans also hungered for first-class citizenship. Sensing an opportunity to break the bonds of Jim Crow, more than 400,000 would answer Uncle Sam's call, only to be placed in segregated units.
When the men went overseas, they assumed that they would be treated with respect, and it was only upon getting there. And I think also when they were in the camps in the United States, it was very clear that things were not going to be the way that they'd hoped. And unfortunately, that segregation mentality did follow them overseas. There were 17,000 African Americans from Tennessee who served in World War I. And it was, as it had always been, military service was a path to citizenship. And if you could prevent that service in an honorable way, the thinking was that you would prevent the servicemen from attaining the same equal rights, the same respect as white men.
Assigned primarily to labor battalions, the overwhelming majority of African Americans would never see combat in World War I. However, 2 black divisions would fight under French command, the 93rd Blue Helmets and the 92nd Buffalo Soldiers, bearing the nickname of the famous Western cavalrymen.
Grant Shockley was from Sparta, Tennessee, and he was actually with the 92nd Division in 368th Infantry Regiment in the Meuse-Argonne. And he wrote a letter home in October, early October, just as Alvin York was earning his Medal of Honor in a different area of the Meuse-Argonne. He said, "I'm quite confident that I'm going to be coming home and see you all again real soon." And within 5 days, on October 8th, he was shot and killed in the Meuse-Argonne.
Throughout the period that we are talking about, and even in some ways today, the professional U.S. military, that is the officer class, was dominated by the South. And so Southern white officers took many of the norms that they were familiar with from their own experiences, many of their same fears and concerns, and transported them across the sea during World War I.
The U.S. Army sought to make those fears known to French officers by distributing a memo detailing how they were expected to treat black soldiers.
The increasing number of Negroes in the United States would create for the white race in the Republic a menace of degeneracy, were it not that an impassable gulf has been made between them. As this danger does not exist for the French race, the French public has become accustomed to treating the Negro with familiarity and indulgence. This indulgence and this familiarity are matters of grievous concern to the Americans. Colonel J.A. Leonard, American Expeditionary Force.
They were particularly concerned about whites not socializing with African American soldiers, fearing in part, of course, that African American soldiers would get too used to this and become too familiar and would bring that home with them. And they were particularly concerned, of course, with French women getting too close to African American soldiers.
When the French ministry learned of the memo, they ordered that all copies be collected and burned. Despite efforts to prevent the proliferation of racial stereotypes, there were instances which would mirror events in the Jim Crow South.
In July 1918, Private William Buckner, who turned out to be from Kentucky, he was accused of raping a white French woman. He pleaded and assured everyone there that he had not raped her, and yet it was decided that he was guilty.
4 years after his execution by hanging, the Army would reopen the case, finding Private Buckner innocent.
His mother, Mary Buckner, never knew the truth of her son, and she wrote to the War Department, and she asked why she had never received any of the insurance money or the benefits that were promised in these cases, and she never received a response.
12 years after Grant Shockley's burial in France, his mother would have the chance to visit her son's grave as part of the federally funded Gold Star Mothers pilgrimages. Learning that the mothers would be segregated during the trip as their sons had been in uniform, she refused.
She was a woman who felt that even if she couldn't go to war, she could still claim her right to citizenship and serve the nation by sacrificing her son or raising her son to go off to war. And she said, "My son served just as the white soldiers served, and it was a dishonor to him to have the pilgrimages on a segregated basis." They decided to send the mothers over on separate ships, and even though they swore that there would be no discrimination, they were sent on cargo ships, whereas the other white mothers went on luxury liners. So it was not the outcome that they had hoped they would have achieved through their service in the First World War.
what African Americans found after both the Civil War and World War I was, for the most part, that their fellow Americans' views were largely unchanged, and their capacity to make political headway on the basis of that military service proved very, very limited. In the context of the post-Civil War period, right, this really comes together in the 1880s into the 1890s, as there is a grand sectional reconciliation between whites of all classes at the expense of African Americans. But this is really brought home in a very salient way in the wake of the First World War.
Instead of receiving recognition for their service, frustrated black veterans returned home to a nation seemingly more determined than ever to deny them full citizenship. Racial tensions boiled over as riots erupted across the country.
African American soldiers returned, and in Baltimore, in D.C., and in Texas, they actually lynched in uniform. 1919 is called the Red Summer. It is disappointing because it was believed that participation would change your position. But what the country said was, yes, you may have gone off, you may have fought in a war to make the world safe for democracy, but your place hasn't changed here.
Being a Southerner, I accepted a lot of things that people fight against today. Back then, I accepted it.
Born in Dayton, Tennessee, 4 years after the First World War, Charles Lewis Henson would see his share of hard times, growing up in the shadow of racial oppression, compounded by the financial burdens of the Great Depression.
Jim Crow was more than a fact across the country, north or south. So African Americans had every reason not to serve, to say we don't want to have anything to do with this, because you're not only oppressing us, but you're brutalizing us in this country and denying us the citizenship that we have already fought for, we've already bled for, we have already died for. But they were loyal Americans.
There was a lot of things that went on that I might not have liked it, but I accepted it. I accepted because duty calls. And you put duty before your feelings.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
When the Second World War comes, many African Americans said, we've seen this movie before. What do we have at stake in this war? But ultimately, at the end of the day, they realized that that was an unsustainable position. The next stage, early in the Second World War, the Pittsburgh Courier, one of the most prominent black newspapers of the time, cast this famous double V for victory. V for victory against racism at home, and V for victory against racism, that is Nazism, abroad. And that was sort of the great vision for the Second World War. But ultimately, the double V for victory gave way itself to much more tame and traditional themes that African Americans, again, needed to demonstrate their valor on the battlefield if they were ever to make headway and to gain first-class citizenship in the United States.
Much like the First World War, African Americans would spend the Second World War in a segregated military, with only a fraction actually seeing combat. The most notable exceptions were the Tuskegee Airmen, 11 of whom were Tennesseans. The famous flyers served with distinction as part of the Army Air Corps. On the ground, the Buffalo Soldiers of the Army's 92nd Infantry would return to action to help defeat deeply entrenched German forces in Italy.
We prided ourselves as artillerymen as being guys that could have 3 shells in the air before you see the burst from the first one. The hard part about artillery is moving up in position into towns that you've been shelling. You get hardened to the point where there's pleasure in seeing the top blown off of a house. That's horrific. You get hardened to the point whereas you're writing on shells to hell with Hitler and hoping that every shell that you shoot is going to end the war. While you're shooting, you might feel good, but when that stuff starts coming back in from the other side, you feel like a plugged nickel, and that's the truth. We had moved out from a place called Pietrasanta, and we started firing at the enemy from those positions. Fog came in. We were shooting away. And about that time, a shell came in and blew our chief of section, Hilton Borer, as high as this ceiling just about. That same shell killed my best friend, Henry Lewis, from Baltimore, Maryland. Not just today, but every day. I go through Hilton Borer flying in the air. My friend Henry Lewis with the shrapnel going through his helmet. I go through that every day of my life.
As they had done time and time again for 80 years, the Buffalo soldiers had proven themselves in battle. After months of bitter combat in mountainous terrain, sustaining nearly 3,000 casualties, they achieved their objective of helping to crush German resistance. The question now was American resistance.
Going through the war, we always said that we want to get back home to see how things are going to be.
Change had to come. You can't argue for change in the rest of the world. You can't defeat a military power that's repressing a minority and leave the minority repressed in your country.
When we got back, we stopped at the station in Cincinnati. The station master said, "I can't feed you blacks and whites at the same time." And we had white soldier and black soldier, both of them, been drinking. Both of them got up and said, "Look, we've been together, we've fought together, and we've been together for months. And if you don't feed us, we're gonna tear this damn station apart." And I don't know about integration and all of that good stuff, but from that point on, the station in Cincinnati was a different place.
1.1 million African Americans served in the American military during World War II. And when those people came home, men and women, they came back home hoping that things would be changed, racially speaking, and they would not be oppressed and treated as unequal citizens, as they had hoped before every American war they had participated in. And so when they returned to small town places like Columbia, Tennessee, they expected to be treated differently.
Navy veteran and welterweight boxing champion James Stevenson shared those expectations, as did his mother, Gladys. Mrs. Stevenson put those expectations to the test in February 1946, when she and James returned a recently repaired radio to the department store in Columbia, Tennessee.
She was not pleased with the way it was repaired. She got into an argument with the repairman. He became abusive. They decided to leave the store with the radio. She was planning to take it someplace else. On the way out, this repairman hit James in the back of the head. And James, being the boxer, turned around, hit him back, knocked him through a glass plate window, and of course he was cut on the glass. The fight continued out on the street. People who were standing around the courthouse came over to help the repairman. There were at least 3 men beating on James. His mom decided to get in and say, "You're not going to be beating on my child." So she joined in the fight.
James and his mother were arrested for fighting, with bonds set at $50 each. Before they could be released, the radio repairman's father arrived, demanding that the Stevensons be charged with attempted murder. The judge agreed and raised the bonds to $3,500 each.
For some in Columbia, that wasn't enough. A mob soon emerged around the courthouse. They wanted more immediate justice. And in Columbia, both black and white knew what that meant. It meant the noose of a lynch mob. Because there had been 2 lynchings in Columbia since the mid-1920s.
James Stevenson's grandmother, fearing for the lives of her children, asked Julius Blair, a local businessman and patriarch of Columbia's black community, for help.
For Julius Blair and the citizens of Maury County, the African Americans, this was like a recent memory. So they basically said, we're not going to have any more social lynchings here in Maury County.
Julius Blair posted bail for the Stevensons and put James on a train to Chicago. Meanwhile, the lynch mob was preparing to search the black part of town for James Stevenson. African Americans, watching the mob from rooftops just a few blocks away, took defensive positions.
And there was just a lot of confusion going on, and they had heard a shot coming from the direction of the African American Business District. And when the officers heard that shot, they went into the district.
They met with armed resistance, and suddenly the Columbia riot of 1946 was underway.
When an officer drew his handgun and ordered the African Americans to drop their weapons, shots rang out from the rooftops, wounding the policemen. This prompted the governor to send in the highway patrol, which led the mob on a path of destruction through the black business district.
They started at one end of the district and went through the entire district, shooting down doors, shooting out windows.
You had highway patrolmen coming into the black business and residential area, conducting searches without warrants. They took away 300 guns from the citizens of Columbia and arrested scores of African American men. And the trials then began. As news of the Columbia riot reverberated across the nation, the NAACP understood they needed to step forth on this case because of some of the poor history of race relations in Maury County and the prospect of additional violence. So Thurgood Marshall joins a Nashville-based defense team led by Z. Alexander Luby, who is certainly one of Tennessee's great champions of the civil rights movement. You have one of the national leaders and one of the state leaders combining forces to protect the men in the Columbia case.
Over 100 African Americans were arrested, 2 of whom were shot to death by police in a reported escape attempt. Ultimately, 25 black men would stand trial before an all-white jury.
They were concerned about a fair trial. So they made a motion for a change of venue. They wanted the trial to be held in Davidson County or Williamson County as opposed to Maury County. But instead, the judge decided to have it in Lawrence County. Lawrence County had a reputation of having more racial issues than Maury County, but the trial was held down in Lawrenceburg.
The trial would last for 2 weeks, and on October 2nd, with the eyes of the nation on Lawrenceburg, the jury reached its decision.
The verdict surprised everyone. Here we are in a county that is more racist, they thought, than Maury County. And the jury fined 23 of the 25 men officially charged innocent. And when one of the jurors was questioned as to why, there was no evidence. This juror said there was just no evidence.
There would be no more lynchings in Maury County or anywhere else in Tennessee, but the blood debt remained unpaid. Fighting for their country hadn't gained African Americans full citizenship. Perhaps fighting for themselves would.
You know, after a while, people just get tired. We had all of these World War II veterans who had been abroad fighting for democracy, and they didn't have the same freedoms here. You know, they were back here being faced with a lot of racial issues, from education to healthcare to public transportation to employment. And they just said, no more. You know, we're going to take a stand. No more.
Change was on the horizon, and the African American veterans are leading the way. Those are such important chapters in the early civil rights history of Tennessee.
With this situation in Maury County in 1946 and with the other violent acts against veterans, President Truman issued that executive order to create the Commission on Civil Rights, and as a result of that, a lot of things changed.
Truman appoints this Presidential Committee on Civil Rights, which emerges in 1948 with a simply remarkable document. Written in 1948, but could as easily have been written in 1988. It was so forward-thinking, a forward-looking, prescient document that so understood what were the structural barriers that stood in the way of all discriminated minorities achieving first-class citizenship in the United States.
With Executive Order 9981, President Harry Truman abolished discrimination in the U.S. Armed Forces on the basis of race, color, religion, or national origin. While an important breakthrough, desegregation wouldn't happen overnight. The last segregated units would dissolve 6 years later.
African Americans do begin to make progress on civil rights, but it is not because of their service during the Second World War. It is rather because of how it is that the war is narrated. After World War I and after World War II, there was a lot of racial tension. There was a lot of racial violence. In some ways, those were remarkably parallel. The big difference is, how are these two wars narrated? The First World War, when Wilson was compelled finally to sell it, was sold as a war to make the world safe for democracy. The Second World War was a war that was all about rights and liberties. The opponent in the First World War, as the Wilson administration portrayed them, were the vicious Huns. The Germans were portrayed as barbaric, as cruel, as hailing from Attila himself. In the Second World War, they were Nazis. And this was a war for democracy against the values of the Nazis. And so sustaining racism became a lot harder during and after the Second World War.
African American military service in the United States is unquestionable, because African Americans have participated with their loyalty, with their service, and their lives since the American Revolutionary War, of course in the American Civil War, the Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, the Vietnam War. But they have been disappointed. Despite that service, we still, as African Americans, are struggling and fighting against racism all across American society. So our military service has not turned into an egalitarian victory for American citizens.
The Citizenship Project is brought to you in part by a grant from the Tennessee Civil War National Heritage Area and the First Tennessee Foundation.